Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good morning to everybody and a very warm welcome this morning. It is indeed a pleasure to welcome you to IPI for this gathering on, I think the headline here is the longest I've ever seen for an IPI event, let me tell you. Strengthening the foundations of peace, how the 2030 agenda reduces global levels of violence and sustains peace. It is a privilege for IPI to co-host this event and very timely discussion with the United States Institute for Peace and the Mercy Corps. The 2030 agenda and the dual sustaining peace resolutions provide global frameworks that reaffirm our commitment to peace and the values that the UN stands for. They are powerful visions that express the aspirations of the global community for inclusive development, accountable institutions, and durable peace. As we witness the rise of populism, the closing of borders, and the rise of inequalities, these frameworks are cornerstones that reaffirm multilateralism. IPI has been working on the links between the 2030 agenda and sustaining peace, both at the policy level and in the field. We are asking questions such as what makes a society peaceful and resilient despite internal vulnerabilities and external pressures. Can the implementation of the SDGs strengthen the linkages between peace and development is a fundamental question. Our research pinpoints different lessons learned. First, peace and sustainable development need to be intentionally planned and be a part of a holistic framework. From our case studies in Guatemala, Gambia, Lebanon, and Myanmar, we found that peace does not necessarily trigger development. These need to be addressed simultaneously, and international support should be more sensitive to the internal dynamics. Second, the 2030 agenda calls for inclusive economic growth. Its implementation therefore requires changing business models that focus on more than just growth. This is a substantive shift that needs the buy-in of the private sector from large and from small companies. The 2030 agenda calls on the private sector to transform into a responsible partner. Changing policies such as hiring more women and offering them equal pay, as well as hiring more youth from underrepresented communities, would have ripple effects on peace and development. Third, and my last point, all our fieldwork points towards the need for more open and accountable state institutions. To address this trust deficit between state and citizen, institutions need to become more responsive to people's needs and aspirations and communicate in an effective and transparent manner. The 2030 agenda's main call is to transform the world ambitiously. The three shifts mentioned above are not easy to do. They require leadership and conviction on the part of all of us. I am glad this morning to see that we have such a wonderful panel that will, I hope, be able to help us reflect on the needed shifts and will also, hopefully, share insights on how to leverage the 2030 agenda to reduce violence and sustain peace. Before we begin, I remind you to please silence your cell phones, though we encourage you to tweet about the event using the hashtag UNGA small XIPI. So thank you very much for your patience and kind attention this morning. And Joseph, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry, for your insightful remarks, which underscore the interdependence between these important frameworks for pursuing both peace and development. Indeed, the inextricable link between the 2030 Agenda and the Sustaining Peace Resolution is becoming increasingly evident. They either stand together or fall together. By strengthening accountable, transparent, inclusive institutions, we not only fortify the foundations of peace, but also pave the road for sustainable development as articulated in Goal 16 and other goals. The concept of sustaining peace places prevention and inclusivity at its core. In addressing the root causes of conflict, the Sustaining Peace Framework argues for a comprehensive, integrated approach that flows through all the three pillars of the UN work: peace and security, development, and human rights. The 2030 Agenda, in its universality and people-centered approach, constitutes for many stakeholders the blueprint for sustaining peace. This morning, we will hear tangible examples on how the implementation of the 2030 Agenda not only reduces violence, but strengthens the foundations for peace. And as Terry mentioned, we have assembled a good panel. We had hoped that a representative from 3 governments would join us this morning, but at the last moment, other competing duties intervened. And so we regret that, but it's understandable given what's happening across the street. But I'm still honored to have joining us 2 distinguished speakers who also are co-sponsors for this event. To my left, Mr. Neil Kenny Geyer, CEO of Mercy Corps, and to my right, Nancy Lindborg, President of the United States Institute for Peace. We feel great affinity with the USIP because peace happens to be our common denominator. And so is Mercy Corps. Just the word mercy alone tells you a lot. If you wish to look at their impressive biographies, please do so. They are in the blue folder that was handed to you when you came. Following their intervention, we will hear from Mr. Shamil Idris, the President and CEO of Search for Common Ground, who will join us later. And once we do that, we will open the floor for questions and answer. And so, according to my instructions, I'm going to give the floor first to you, Neil.
Thank you. First of all, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you. I know this is the time of the week in Crazy Week when everyone's pulled in 1,000 different directions, and where we're all more thinking about internal peace and breathing than we are necessarily about external peace and the world. So, but you all look great, and thank you for being here. I also know there are a lot of folks in this room who do a lot on behalf of peace every day. So I just want to say thank you for that. I want to say I'm thrilled to be here with Nancy, a very special and dear friend, and I admire so much what the U.S. Institute for Peace does. It absolutely, and her leadership, as we all know, is incredible. So wonderful to be here, and wonderful to be here with the International Peace Institute and with someone as distinguished as Yusuf. So thank you. I want to be kind of very brief, and maybe kick us off a little higher level. And I know in the question and answer, we'll come back and look at some of the the concrete examples, and it's so important to build the evidence base that peace does work and we can have interventions that make a difference. But maybe where I want to first start is just acknowledging, and I think all of us feel it, in the New York Times, what was it, a couple weeks ago, had this sense, it almost feels like apocalyptic times, right? It's as if God or Gaia, or however you describe the force that unites us all, is not very happy, is off kilter. We have wars and talk of wars and famines and earthquakes and, once in 500,000 year storms that seem to be recurring simultaneously at the same time. And it throws us off. And here we are sitting across the street from an institution that all of us know was built for different times. It's probably not fit for purpose for the challenges we fit today. And yet, it's what we have. So we have to do our best to make it work. And yet these can feel like very unsettling times. Someone once described, it's a world today that is multipolar, and it's multi-stakeholder, and it's multi-track. And that's very different than the world of nations to nations or some of the global institutions that used to exist to solve the problems. And so today, we know that the institutions have to be able to navigate a multipolar world. There is no issue out there in which you're not going to bring together government, private sector, civil society. It's a multi-stakeholder world, and we've got to think of approaching peace in a multi-stakeholder context. And I would say, and I know it went out of vogue for a while, that I think there's never been a better time for multi-track efforts to go on. Quiet, smart, but where relationships and the ability to get in and bring and convene different groups has never been more important. So I guess my plea in all of that is the relevance of organizations like the U.S. Institute of Peace, the International Peace Institute, Mercy Corps, all the organizations that you all represent. It's never been more relevant. There's never been a more important time for all of us to rise up. And in many ways, what's exciting is to see that peace, I know there's some people who still think of peace as Pollyannish and weak, but we know better. But it is time to bring back peace and make it on the development agenda every bit as important as dealing with HIV, every bit as important as combating climate change. Because in our world, we all know the number one driver of extreme poverty today is conflict. Right? The number one driver, not among the drivers, not one of the drivers, but the number one driver. And we see a rise in fragility. So I guess my plea, and I'll get back to some of the concrete examples that I think are so critically important, is that there's never been a more relevant time or a more important time for all the peace actors to rise up and make our voices count, perhaps in more powerful ways than ever before. Final thing I would say is, particularly, again, since we're here and since we're across the street from the United Nations, and so much of this week is about, in one form or another, the Sustainable Development Goals. And yes, they're all important, and what's wonderful about them is they're inclusive of all the member states, of all of us. And for those of us in this room, I think we do know if we can't make progress on SDG 16, it is that kind of last mile, right? If we can't make progress on that one, we're not going to make progress on all the other goals. Extreme poverty, poor education, poor health outcomes, violence, it's all beginning to cluster in fragile states. And so that's the pathway to achieving many of those goals. And if we're going to do that, you all know this better than any. We've got to make some reform efforts, particularly in how we allocate official development assistance, perhaps a lot more. We all know it, roughly 9% goes to some form of prevention, justice, security, whereas 92% is more in the traditional, 8% is devoted to non-peace prevention. I think we need to change that, and we need to build a body of evidence that peace works, and then build that coalition and rise up. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really interesting that you should mention how our attention is captured by so much gloom and doom. as if war and violence and proxy wars is becoming the new norm. In fact, I was reading yesterday a research from CIPRI that says we are living in the most peaceful era of human history, regardless of what is happening. But there's so much captivating. The other point that I felt is important is that you mentioned is this is the time for multi-stakeholder engagement, and multilateralism should be in the forefront of this effort. Nancy.
Thank you, Yusuf. And let me also thank Tourier for your wonderful introduction for the partnership with IPI and Mercy Corps. You'll see in our bios that Neil and I have a long engagement on these issues together. So it's wonderful to be here with you, Neil, and Yusuf, thank you. So ditto to everything that Neil just said. I fully subscribe to the key points, and I would build off of your point, Yusuf, that all of that sense of chaos and disruption is happening against a backdrop of this long peace, and I think probably everybody here has been a part of making sure that we have the gains that we've made over the last several decades. Development indicators are at some of the highest that we've seen. Interstate conflict is flatlined. We've got levels of violence are down over the last 70 years, and yet we've got all of these new crises that are upon us. Neil outlined some of them: 300% rise in terrorism, historic levels of people disrupted. And so I think the question that we're wrestling with is this the new normal? Is this the new chaotic future that we're facing in the breakdown of these systems that we've developed? Or is it a wake-up call that is the call to action that Neil just put down, that calls all of us to double down on understanding what are the ways forward and how do we make a difference? And for those of us who are incurable optimists and who get up every day thinking that, yes, it's the call to action, I'm very heartened by some of the efforts to put Goal 16, a hard negotiated goal, into the SDGs. I agree with Neil that without Goal 16, we will not sustain the gains and the investments that we've made over the last decades. Also, the embrace by the World Bank that without tackling fragility at the heart of these conflict situations, we won't be able to advance the development agenda. And the report that's coming out later this week that the UN and the World Bank did together, looking at how to advance an agenda of prevention, as well as the resolutions adopted last year by the UN on prevention. These are all, I think, strong indications that there is an effort to grapple with this core driver of poverty, the core driver of a lot of the violence that's coming forward. And it is this fraying of the state-society relationship. It's the many countries that are either illegitimate or unable to care for their people that I think Goal 16 really gets at. And so as we look at how to move this forward from ideas and compacts and papers, it's what are the practical strategies for both creating the evidence and creating the change on the ground that we need. And even as we're looking at these new great power competitions, we're seeing that those are playing out in the fragile states that either are open to those kinds of predatory actions because they're in full conflict, Libya, Yemen, Syria, or they are vulnerable because of the kind of investments that are that could be destabilizing as they're made. And this encompasses a lot of countries in Africa. So I want to just put down 3 quick examples of strategies. And the first is, I think that what we see over and over again is sometimes in the absence of being able to create national peace, there are local actors working hard on creating local pockets of peace. And that doesn't get seen or understood often by the international community and media. And we need to understand, embrace, and support those actors who are the everyday heroes, creating local peace accords, creating the kind of educational avenues that give young people a way to bring peace to their communities. In Iraq, where USIP works, we're seeing that local Shia and Sunni tribal leaders and ethnic leaders and some of the local government leaders are, as ISIL recedes and is defeated in many of these communities, they're coming together to create local peace agreements that say, we will not continue to fight, because there are many disagreements that they still have to navigate, but they've pledged to do so peacefully. That is a huge, important step, even in the absence of the more national level peace agreements. Secondly, I was just in Minneapolis last week, where the Tunisian quartet was celebrated at the Nobel Peace Prize Forum, which is an annual event. And Yusuf, you may want to say more about this from your personal experience, but we should celebrate the fact that the Nobel Peace Prize went to the quartet, 4 civil society actors who enabled that country to navigate a pathway out of violence. And they were discussing what were the essential ingredients. And I think that it begins to be the roadmap for the SDGs as well, that they had invested in education for many decades, that women were fully participating in the process, that they had key institutions that were able to withstand the transition, and most importantly, they had strong civil society organizations, which is a way of unpacking some of what Neil was noting of the multi-stakeholder world that is essential for moving forward. And then finally, I would note the importance of a shared framework. And that's both what the SDGs give us, but a cautionary note that I worry that a lot of this conversation is happening only within the development world. That without bringing in our diplomatic and our security forces from across the street and within each of our governments, we may end up working at cross purposes. And so as much as we're celebrating what the UN, the World Bank, the SDGs, the multi-stakeholder approaches, if we don't bring in our diplomatic and security members into that conversation, we will not get the collective action and the collective understanding to make a difference. And we've seen that in a number of places. USIP worked with Chatham House and Stanford University to look at a decade of efforts in Afghanistan, where we learned that, in fact, from US investments, that we had 3 separate lines of effort that canceled each other out. There was an intelligence effort that was working to defeat al-Qaeda, a military effort that was working to defeat Taliban, and a state-building exercise that was trying to rebuild the Afghan state. And the methods and approaches actually canceled each other out. And so this is the importance of a shared framework, and we should be certain not to only have a development conversation, but to broaden it if we really want to get traction on this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you for those concrete examples of intercommunal peace in Iraq, the Tunisia example, and you're absolutely right to insist on the role of education. I think what has kept Tunisia from the brink of the precipice are educated women. And also
everybody says that.
It is, I live it, I've seen it. I was in the parliament when these women were arguing for a law that criminalizes all forms of violence against women. And that there is no chance in hell for any framework to gain traction if women are not free from violence, so they can fully participate. And I've seen what education, the 50-year investment in education has done. And also, thank you for the importance that you highlighted of shared framework. Otherwise, we indeed... While you think about your own examples, my dear friend, I want to share with you what the example that the ambassador of Senegal would have shared with us had he been here. Because I asked him to come and think about the importance of the SDG and the contribution that development has in laying the foundations for self-sustainable peace. And he had 3 things he wanted to share had he been here. One is provide electricity, health, sanitation, and water to marginalized community. And more importantly, communication means. His view is that governments may receive juridical legitimacy from election, but unless they gain the performance legitimacy through the provision of basic services, there will not be peace. So that is one example that he shared, that it is important that we gain popular peace as well as whatever liberal peace we want to. The second point he shared with me, he said that, yes, jobs are very important. Justice is important. Security is equally important. But voice, in other words, spaces for safe expression of your grievances is one of the ways that countries like his own, whom, if you look at geographically where Senegal is, and if you understand their internal vulnerabilities and external pressures, that safety valve is what enables them to withstand turmoil at the top and remain peaceful. The third thing he mentioned, which is really very important, is he said that we conjugate everything in the plural. In other words, we're a pluralist nation, and we are proud of diversity, and we safeguard it, and our political narrative do not cross the line. And so he says both development and governance are very important partners in achieving sustainable development and in laying the foundation for less reversible and hopefully sustainable peace. So I hope I faithfully conveyed what he would have shared with you. And the turn to you for examples.
Can I just
Sure.
add one more Senegal note
Please.
that I think is important? It's because I was there, I guess, a year or two ago, and a number of women had just been elected to parliament.
Yeah.
And I was congratulating one of them. And she looked at me and she said, don't think this happened overnight. We've been working on getting women into office for 20 years. And so there's this time dimension that we all need to keep very firmly in mind as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. It took Tunisia 50 years to gain what we're now enjoying from the contributions of our women leaders.
Great, thank you. And we miss those wise words, but I think you captured them so well in terms of a formula that we hope more leaders would embrace of their countries. I want to provide a couple of concrete examples, and just to show the importance of evidence and learning. We've got to build the same sort of rigorous frameworks and evidence that we have in programs like child survival or in some of our economic development programs in peace. And because we have to overcome the perception that sometimes all these efforts are a cottage industry out there. And yes, we can point to some bright spots here and there, but it doesn't add up. And so I think we all have a responsibility to bring forward action, research, and learning in more powerful. At least for our own organization, I'm going to provide two examples that help enlighten us and maybe are useful in the conversation. And I'll stick with Afghanistan at one point. So my organization, we had a mega grant from the British government to provide jobs and income for youth in the southern part of Afghanistan, and particularly in Helmand and Kandahar. And it was, and of course, the whole reason the British government, I don't know if anyone's here from the British government, but one of the drivers of the grant was the belief that if you could get young people a job, it would turn them away from violent extremism, from political violence, let's be honest, from support for the Taliban. So this was, probably $75 million over multiple years. And And by an economic development program, it was phenomenally successful. Something like 80% of the young people who went through our vocational training, who went through, got jobs. 6 months later, 8 months of that 80%, 80% of that 80% still had those jobs. Phenomenal success, except for one thing, except when you look at the before survey of attitudes toward the Taliban, at the end of the program, the young people had stronger, more positive feelings toward the Taliban than they did toward the government. And one of the underlying drivers of the program, again, was this belief that if you just give people a job, that alone, it's not jobs are important. And so that was a real wake-up call for us, a wake-up call for our donor, but the evidence was clear. And so then, okay, we know what doesn't work, but what does work? What can work? Well, this is where, again, if we're in so many other development spheres, we would do random control trials, we would do multiple pilots, we would check, we would fail quickly, we'd iterate, adapt, and then move forward. It feels in a lot of our peace programs, we don't do that. We get stuck in general approaches. But in Afghanistan, we just completed a major study with Princeton and Yale. This did have random control trials. It was at Rebecca Wolf, who is our expert in this, is back here, so she can give you all the real details. As the CEO, I kind of make it up a little. No, I give the higher level. But the point of it is that we played around. Okay, what is a magic combination, if there is, that you can provide a young person that seems to increase positive attitudes toward their government? Now, if the government continues to be abusive, obviously there's not much you can do. But in this case, what Yale and Princeton's researchers looked at, documented, ran random control trials with, was that if you combine a small cash grant and stipend with vocational education, not vocational education alone, not a grant alone, but if you combine those in combination, it seems in quite significant ways, up to around 40%, if you didn't do that, will come away with a more positive feeling toward their government and a greater willingness to work with the government and be a productive citizen in the course of their own action. And so that's beginning to change now. The Afghan government has taken note of this. They've begun to adopt some of their own national policies in response to this, and we continue to have sort of a rigorous review of this evidence going forward. So we can feel that we're not just assuming certain things, but we're being driven by evidence as we move forward. And I think that's critical. I know it sounds kind of small, and you go, wow, really? But we need to bring those kind of approaches if we're going to get the kind of results we all aspire to in this space.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy that you highlighted the needs to question from time to time the assumptions behind some of these initiatives. He was talking about Afghanistan. Do you have any comment on what Neil just shared with us?
I do. And first of all, the whole question of evidence is really hard. I mean, I think everybody who works in this field looks longingly at the health world, where you have really clear indicators and statistics that can tell you whether you're on the right path to success or not. And I worry a lot that we have a resurgence right now of focus on peace with a preventive agenda that's articulated by some of the key institutions, that if we don't come forward with some ideas of how we know we're on the right road, that we will fall off this moment with very dangerous implications. So we do all need to collectively work on that together. And there is, I think we're all seeing, even during this week of conversation, a reaching for just the economic solution, the investment solution. And so Neil's point is a really important one, as was the Senegal example, that jobs and private sector investment alone that's not the full recipe. That won't take you forward. And I want to add that in addition to the development investments and approaches, there are some core skills and tools that if people within their own communities and their own governments are going to be able to really bridge those divides. It's the skills of facilitation, of negotiation, of mediation at community levels, on up, or even family levels. I met a young law student in Afghanistan who told me that, after 40 years of being in constant conflict, that her community and even her family had lost the ability to resolve basic differences without resorting to violence. And so it's helping to disrupt those spin cycles of conflict, especially in communities that have been really ravaged by violent conflict, and that circle of what's prevention and what's resolution that becomes so unclear. And going back again to the Tunisian quartet, they cited that one of the reasons for the success of that country is that they did listen to each other. They listened to views that were not their own. And Hassan Adrisi, the head of the labor union, even talked about the importance of labor understanding the view of the businesses and of the employers. And so it's ensuring that those skills and those approaches are brought into the development agenda.
Thank you very much. We just joined, I would take it, by Mr. Shamil Idris, who is the President CEO of Search for Common Ground. I don't know if your ear was ringing outside and see what we are discussing. And we were discussing some specific examples of where we can marry the development agenda and the peace agenda without hurting either, and the necessity for action research to understand what's working, what's not working, and to make sure that in the case of Afghanistan, in our anxiousness to resolve the problem, we do not get to peace. This is perhaps with respect to the need to providing, or at least the assumption that if you provide a job to youth, you will wean them from violent extremism or their sympathies for some of these groups that are not working for peace. So before I open the floor to the audience, I'd like to give you the floor for a few minutes to share with us your thoughts.
Thank you. And it's good to be among friends and colleagues whom we know well. My ears were not ringing, but I think they've rung enough in the previous conversations we've had over years on this subject. And I'm sorry that I've had to come late, and I'm sorry I'm going to have to leave early, but I'm very grateful to you for giving me this platform, and I will be brief. At the heart of the Sustaining Peace agenda and framework is a focus on prevention, as has been said here, really through sustainable development and inclusion. And I'd like to say a couple words about prevention and inclusion, because while SDG 16 articulates the nexus between the 2030 agenda and sustaining peace, there is some skepticism that we're aware of in some quarters about the practicality and whether and how it can be made real. Well, we know how to make it real. The peace-building sector has nearly 4 decades now of experience with plenty of lessons learned that, yes, do need to be researched and captured, but we are much further along than we were 4 decades ago. And the second thing that we know is if we do not make it real, we're going to put at risk the entire 2030 agenda and the viability of every other sustainable development goal. We know that 10 years ago, 80% of humanitarian aid went to dealing with the people displaced by natural disasters, and that today, 80% of that aid is going to meet the needs of people whose lives have been destroyed or disrupted by violent conflict. We're struggling to manage a refugee crisis of unprecedented scale and scope, while we're confronting the prospect for the first time in history of 4 simultaneous famines, every one of which has been primarily caused or greatly exacerbated by violent conflict. And this is why the World Bank last year revisited their 2011 report on conflict, security, and development, and they changed one of their primary findings from saying that conflict is one of the causes of suffering and poverty to now read that conflict is the primary cause of suffering and poverty today. So the problem is clear, and it was articulated to me really succinctly through an anecdote of a colleague of mine who was meeting with the National Security Advisor of one of the largest, wealthiest, most populous countries in the world, who said to him, you know, I'm a military man, And I know when there is violence in this one district that we had trouble with for many, many years, I know that I have one button to push. I can send in the military and I know I'll get short-term stability, but I know I'm also going to be buying longer-term problems. I need more buttons to push. And our sector, represented on this panel, and thousands of people not in this room, many of whom risk their reputations, others risk their lives to build bridges and peace and build peace in divided communities. We are in the business of creating more buttons to push. Now, the methodology works, and it's actually rather simple. It begins by building relationships and trust, whether between divided communities or between communities and the institutions that are supposed to govern and serve them. Our colleagues at Mercy Corps know this well. We at Search for Common Ground know this well. But relationship building is not enough. It has to be translated into enduring change. And we see plenty of examples of how enduring change happens. It usually takes one of three forms. It either takes the form of becoming institutionalized, so that after many years of painstaking work in Nigeria, our local team there were able to work closely with the government, the governing body at the plateau state of Nigeria to create a position, a government position for community engagement and conflict resolution, because they understood well that simply introducing policies or trying to address the farmer-herder conflicts or the other things that are plaguing that particular state and the broader region cannot be done unless there's a true engagement and inclusion of the local populations. It can take the second form, not just of institutionalization or of a shifting of social norms. This is why our teams in South Sudan were working in the protection camps. People who've been living there for many years have been using community theater and other forms of outreach to help shift the way that people deal with their differences within the camps and reducing cases of violent conflict and abuses in those camps. Or it can take the form of markets. When supply, demand, and capital, when local markets emerge that actually resource what I would call a peace-building intervention. We've seen this with one of the largest gold mining companies in a particular country in Africa that I won't name, in which we received about a year and a half ago a request from this gold mining company to form a 3-year relationship. We had been working on a year-to-year basis with our local team there. And I went to see the CEO and I said, this is really interesting. We'd love to do this, but tell me why you've made this decision after these 4 years of work that you now want to partner with us over the next 3 years. And he said, well, we did an internal assessment and we found that the use of ammunition at our mine sites, this was mainly non-lethal ammunition, bean bags and tear gas and rubber bullets, et cetera, that it was down more than 90%. Our overall security budget across the mine sites that we managed was down nearly 60%, from $46 million a year to $19 million a year. And yet our security results were way up. And we credited a lot of that to the work that your team has been doing between local communities and our mine site managers. This creates a market. This does not sit in the CSR unit, the corporate social responsibility unit of this. This sits within the security and communication and community relations part of that body. So whether you're triggering an enduring change through institutionalization, through acculturation or a shift in social norms, or through commercialization, the emergence of markets, we see how the transformation of relationships can lead to enduring change. But it all starts with that transformation of relationships. And I will leave you with two last points. If you take the case that's, I believe, already been made by the esteemed panelists about the need to invest more in the prevention agenda, I'll give you one simple example. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there were clashes that led to the displacement of 100,000 Congolese, and we looked at the fact that, on average, the refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo are displaced for 11 years, on average. The UNHCR there courageously and creatively decided to take a portion of their humanitarian relief budget and provide it to us to help mediate the disputes that were at the core of this crisis. Every single one of those 100,000 refugees was able to return within 4 years instead of 11 years, restart their lives, not to mention not costing the international community what it costs for housing, feeding, protecting that population. And the last point that I'm going to make is this is actually much more profound in my view than simply a question of how we deal with countries that are collapsing from violent conflict or at the risk of violent conflict. The entire global agenda, 2030 agenda, is under debate. I think this UNGA is being watched more closely than any any UNGA for many, many years, because people around the world know that the world is at an inflection point. The forces that are trying to advance that agenda are being challenged, and not insignificantly, by major forces that are questioning the very worthwhile nature of collective action in the first place. So how do we apply an inclusive lens to our own populations, and are we bringing them along with this agenda? Inclusivity and engagement and bringing communities along is critical, and if you don't do it, the whole thing will collapse. And I think we're seeing already now the rise of far-right nationalist movements that are not debating how we work collectively, but whether we should do it at all in the first place. And so I really mean it when I said at the outset that I think what we have to be doing here is really fundamental, and it's not siloed off as simply advancing SDG 16. It's a way of approaching governance and social change that is absolutely critical. We have to ask ourselves who loses if we win. We have to not assume that everybody assumes they're going to win if the SDGs are advanced. There are some industries that don't have a place in a successful advancement of the 2030 agenda. There are other industries that will be given, a new birth. But we have to engage with the populations who don't see their livelihoods in that future world, whether in the countries in conflict or those that are putting the majority of funds into this effort. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So I think it's a good reminder of the need of many buttons to create and to push, and the need to institutionalize trust and for enduring change. And I think the last comment that he made, rather sobering. We should not take this consensus around the 2030 agenda as irreversible, particularly for those who see some parts of the international community a danger into bringing the 2030 agenda to the conflict resolution industry, and therefore risk securitizing the development agenda. And there is a lot of pushback taking place as we speak, as they are negotiating this resolution in the Security Council. So it is important that we be wary and aware of how fragile that consensus is. And I'm happy to him for reminding us not to continue singling out Goal 16. The floor is open for whoever. 1, 2, and 3. So we'll start with Jimena.
Thank you so much for this interesting conversation. I have
Jimena
from IPI. Yeah. We are launching tomorrow a report on the private sector. And what I wanted to ask was, how have you worked with the private sector in this realm of connecting peace and sustainable development? One of our findings is that if, as you mentioned before, if you only eject funds without a type of conflict-sensitive approach or sustaining peace approach, you can do more harm than good. But we also know that without the involvement of the private sector, we won't be able to achieve all the goals. So what have you learned in your experience with the private sector in creating these new types of partnerships? Thank you.
Thank you. Next, you.
Good morning, and thank you very much for organizing this seminar. My name is Bjorn Gilsetter. I'm the Special Representative for the World Bank to the UN. Appreciate the couple of references to our work that I heard this morning, not least about the forthcoming study, which is coming out tomorrow afternoon, which is on the prevention of violent conflict. And there's a press release going out, I think, in the afternoon tomorrow by the Secretary General and the President of the World Bank Group. It's the first time ever that the two institutions have come together around such a study. And it's been conducted over the last 12 months, I believe. And I wanted to spill a few of the beans from that study without releasing all the salient points, but because they speak to what we're discussing this morning. First, and I think what I hope will make the news, is that it tries to make the business case for prevention and prevention of violent conflict. I know academics have done that, the sort of the cost-benefit analysis, but this will be, I think, the first time that you have these two institutions and to some extent endorsing that work. And you will see that the finding says that prevention works, saves lives, and is cost effective. But the incentives to collaborate and act early are lacking. There's an urgent need for more collective solutions at regional, national, and local levels. There's a lot of emphasis on grievances, and responding to grievances. Policies and programs for prevention need to address grievances around exclusion from access to power, economic and social opportunity, and security, and the way they can be mobilized for violence. When state capacity or legitimacy is weak, grievances are often reinforced. On the other hand, an effective and legitimate state that is sufficiently inclusive will play an important role in avoiding conflict, violence. And the final point that I want to make is that it concludes, as I think we've heard from a couple of people already, that supporting growth and poverty alleviation is not enough. When risks are building up or are high, preventing violence requires moving from traditional economic and social policies towards seeking inclusive solutions that aim to change the incentives of actors to act violently. So let me just end on the point that the World Bank is fully committed to the 2030 agenda, all across the bank, including in the SDG 16 related work, and the doubling of resources for during the IDA replenishment last year from 6-7 billion in the previous three-year period to 12 to 14 billion is a clear sign of the shareholders and the donors to the bank agreeing with us on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Please.
Hi, Elizabeth Dickinson. I'm the humanitarian editor at DevEx. I wanted to ask you about this piece of engaging with governments and really institutionalizing some of these programs. And so the idea of bringing in diplomatic and security colleagues, in my experience reporting, this is something that often makes humanitarians a little bit uncomfortable, and they sort of have to step a little bit outside their safe zone. So part one of that question is sort of what are the parameters of that engagement? What should it look like? And part two of that is what do you do in a context in which the government is fundamentally predatory, and so engagement isn't necessarily possible with the de jure authorities? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's take these first three questions, and I'll come back to the audience. Nancy, would you like to start with the last one?
Sure.
The engagement.
Yeah. Elizabeth, this of course has been a core question in the humanitarian world for a long time. I was very heartened at the kind of conversations that were going on at the Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, I guess a year and a half ago, where there were a lot of humanitarians who were grappling with the fact that, you know, the cost of humanitarian action is going up, the crises are lasting longer, and, you know, you can only do Band-Aids for so long before anybody who's in that field starts saying, you know what, we gotta get to the heart of what is causing these. And so I think there will always be a need and a role for those organizations that are only working on the response. You know, the MSFs, the ICRCs of the world. But there is also, and I know Neil will want to comment on this because Mercy Corps is a good example of organizations that understand that there are ways that you can engage, maybe not with a predatory national government, but often at the local level with local councils or ways of working that are critical for laying the seeds for recovery. And that there is a need to understand with greater sophistication the political dynamics in which one is working, even with humanitarian assistance. So I think that there's been a maturation within the humanitarian world of understanding how a response fits into a larger picture. That doesn't mean that the humanitarian response needs to be hand in hand with a military response, but it does mean that you want people to have a shared understanding of the problem set and the ways forward so that you're not working at cross purposes. And I think there are ways to do that. Ultimately, and USIP partnered with the Carnegie Foundation and Center for New American Security to do a study group and a report on fragility where we concluded that ultimately you need local partnership if you're going to really advance an agenda of moving forward out of conflict into a more sustainable peace. And it goes to what we've talked about, the importance of locally led processes. So if you have a fundamentally predatory government, there will be limits, and maybe all you're able to do is to provide humanitarian assistance and work at the local level. So you do what you can where you can. Fundamentally, you're going to need at some point the emergence of partners. And that can take time, and we see the difference between Karzai and Ghani in Afghanistan, for example, and even still the challenges with corruption and growing terrorism in Afghanistan. But I feel very positive about the evolution of that conversation.
Thank you very much. Neil, in addition to whatever additional comments you may wish to share in response to the question there, maybe you could also address the aspect of how to engage the private sector in the implementation of the 2030 agenda, but doing it from a conflict-sensitive point of view.
Yeah, so let me start with that first and then come back and then on the private sector. Great question. What I would love to do is the World Economic Forum published a report just last year on the role, I don't know if you've seen it, on the role of how important private investment is in order to both prevent conflict and to advance peace. And I think there were 10 or 12 concrete examples cited. I remember interviewing President Santos about the role of the private sector in Colombia. And again, he made such an articulate case for that. So, frankly, there's often a focus on sort of big names, global private sector, when in almost every case, more important is the local private sector and making markets work on behalf of peace, on behalf of the poor. That's just absolutely critical. So if you haven't seen that report, I'll make sure you get it, and maybe that can be shared because it highlights it very well with concrete examples. And in that, maybe it's a good chance to say, all of us are thrilled that even more than ever, the World Bank is jumping into this space now and helping to overcome, which Nancy worked so hard on and made great progress on, that kind of artificial relief to development divide, recognizing that it's not a sequential process at all, that you can do everything simultaneously. Often you can ameliorate suffering, address root causes, work for development, build resilience almost simultaneously. And in fact, that's a best practice. So it's great to see the World Bank jumping into this. In terms of the sort of I think the humanitarian community is somewhat at a crossroads. And I think we've been too rigidly, this is me speaking, we've been too rigidly stuck on concepts of neutrality. And a world in which 80% of the crises today are driven by conflict, I think it's irresponsible to not wrestle with addressing root causes. And I think it's very easy to stand just you're on service delivery. And that can go on and be crying. And I think some of us have to speak up in a respectful way and challenge that paradigm. And our organization is one of those that is going to speak up in a respectful. And I'll give you a concrete example. It's hard. We all wrestle with it. Yemen today, is tough. We have to navigate relationships with the Houthis. We have to navigate relationships with the Saudis. We have to navigate relationships with a whole bunch of other actors on the ground. And so I don't think it's as straightforward as some of our colleagues might. If you could take 50 million from the Saudis and make a significant impact on cholera, shouldn't you do it? If you can operate independently, if you can make, or are you just contributing to be a party to the conflict? Well, I'm not sure there's a straightforward right or wrong answer to that. And what if you could take that money and what if you could begin to build relationships with a new funding source that is global and begin to help them at the margins be more strategic, more wise, more impactful in the work that they do? You should think seriously about it. You shouldn't knee-jerk say, no, we're not going to do it, in my opinion. So I do think the kind of issues that we face today in a more messy political world in which the addressing root causes is more critical, is causing us to rethink a lot of the traditional humanitarian paradigms, and that's a good thing.
Thank you very much. We have time for one or two more questions.
Can I just add quickly on the private sector? One thing that the private sector does far more nimbly than government sector is work on the whole importance of data technology, and harnessing that for this agenda is a very important aspect. It's a different role for the private sector than just making investments. But one of the things that USIP did was spin off into a 501c3, something called Peace Tech Lab, which is meant to contribute to the development of the peace industrial complex, and harnessing those technologies in the service of this agenda.
Thank you very much. Here, and then the last back. No, give it the floor first. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, as you all know, we're streaming this live on Facebook, and we have a question from Rebecca Thompson, who is a team leader and program director with Mercy Corps. She says, while the importance of the role of civil society has steadily been taking more precedence in the narrative for change in the system in recent years, have we really seen a shift in the way we work at scale? Have the results we've seen to date been token or superficial? Does the panel feel we're on the right path in promoting the role of local civil society actors in international action? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then the gentleman, yes, please.
Okay, hi. Alain Chuden from Good Governance Africa. Thank you very much for having us here today. So a question based on a comment, having previously worked with the agency in the building next door, we saw that in Syria, when we were doing an assessment there, that as much as we talk about local actors being taken seriously, very often we saw them being undermined by various INGOs and other multilateral entities. Neil, yours wasn't one of them, so that's a really positive thing. So when Nancy spoke about recognizing local actors, I wondered how within your own organizations you get a trickle-down effect from where you sit and wanting actually to take local players seriously to having people in the field take care of that, because I found, having been based in the field, that very often there's a mismatch between what's happening on the ground and the good intentions at a higher level. So if you could maybe speak to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The last one, yeah.
Hi, Abigail Ruane, WILP, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, longest-standing women's peace organization. Thank you so much for your comments. I really liked, Youssef, your question about how do we marry development and peace without hurting either. And on our side, we really see that the Sustainable Development Goals are an important tool, but only if they're implemented through a coherent framework which recognizes the point of sustainable development, which is that we change what we're doing. So we can't keep the traditional business as usual approach. We have to have economic development that promotes human rights, including women's rights, and protects the environment. WILP has found that arms transfers, including from Germany, UK, France, and Sweden, through the Saudi coalition, has reduced the social, economic, and cultural rights of women and increased gender-based violence through the Saudi coalition in Yemen. And this is just one example of the link between gender-based violence, which is under 5.2 of the SDGs, and arms, which is 16.4, and brings attention to the need to address spillover effects as part of realizing the SDGs and building peace. One good practice of how this is being done is in Sweden, where our section have used the SDGs to bring attention to the need to not dump military waste in drinking water as an imperative consistent with feminist foreign policy, as well as goals on water and peace. We all know the stats that gender equality is the number one predictor of peace, that feminist movement building is the number one predictor of reducing violence against women, but we still have only 2% of aid on peace and security going to gender equality, and one F-35 plane that has the budget of the entire global women's movement. So my question for you is, how do we ensure that the SDGs are not just used to reinforce the patriarchal status quo that we've lived with for far too long? What can we do to promote policy coherence that builds off of a women's human rights standard and a women's peace and security agenda?
Thank you. Message clear. Statement is clear. I think when it comes to Yemen, many of these women advocates are saying there is no sustaining peace in Yemen if there is no environmental health component, precisely because of the way the contaminated water and the toll it's taking on population. But essentially we have related question, one from our audience, who is no stranger to Mercy Corps, and one from this gentleman, both related to local actors. Are they making an impact? Have they been recognized in the role of the civil society and local actors? And how can we act, if I heard the second question, in such a way that it does not undermine and truly recognize the role of the local actors, so there is no contradiction but the top level and the ground? Who would like to start? Would you like to jump on this?
Sure. I think we see over and over again that you don't have a sustained peace if it's not locally owned and driven. And so when we talk about bringing the research agenda forward, that's one of the key factors for really moving a country forward. Tunisia's, the current poster child for what it looks like when it's really, really locally owned and driven. We know that there are a number of countries that don't have the level of capacities, the education and the women who can really take that sophisticated of an approach and drive it forward. So sometimes there needs to be, you need to start earlier in the effort in terms of trying to build those capacities and support actors as they create their own coalitions and capacities. USIP works exclusively through local partners. We have very small teams in any country in which we work, and the majority of the action is with local organizations, local partners, and we see enormous results in places like Iraq, Tunisia, South Sudan. The conundrum is where you don't have those capacities or where it's more dangerous for them. And Neil, I know you'll have a chance to speak more. Do I think civil society is being recognized, and is it at scale? I think it is being recognized, it is at scale, and much more needs to be done. And this is the last time I'll mention it, but the fact that the Nobel Peace Prize went to a quartet of civil society actors is one of the best things that could happen in terms of really bringing that up a notch. And then just a quick comment on Abigail. I mean, I think your comment. I think that what partly we're grappling with, and you allude to it, is the complexity of these problems and the interrelationship between all of these factors, and the challenge of creating approaches that are able to deal with more than one problem in isolation, which then doesn't get at the larger solution. But if you take the inclusive framework and the evidence, when half a population is not able to contribute to the solution, or in fact is being further repressed, then you really won't get the kind of traction that you need. And so whether it's through the SDGs or the Women, Peace and Security, I mean, we have a lot of frameworks that call that out, and then it's just what are the practical ways of moving that forward in the complicated, unique context of each country.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Neil?
Yeah, so I'm relieved that Mercy Corps wasn't singled out, and I'd be horrified if we were. But I want to believe that any international NGO worth its weight in gold or salt is always working with and through and empowering local partners, local actors. I agree totally with what Nancy, if development is not sustainable, peace is not sustainable if it's not locally owned and driven, and we all need to be very mindful of that. Lifting up to the civil society question, I don't think any of us would think we're making the kind of impact that we all aspire to. We all want to do more. We look at a tough world and we go, what else do we need to do? And if I can, maybe direct criticism at civil society and at my own organization in the process. I do think as civil society, I think any big change happens in a multi-stakeholder framework. Occasionally there are big movements that come along that maybe transform everything, but most of the change is in a multi. And so it's really critical that as we strengthen and build civil society ourselves, that part of those tools and skill sets, how do you really embrace and work with the private sector in a responsible, inclusive way? How do you work with governments? How do you work with security actors, again, in a responsible way? Because it's only when we can bring those together and when we see our own strength in relationship to a multi-stakeholder framework that I think we're going to get the kind of impact, the kind of change that we all aspire to.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Can I just add one comment to that? Because I think there is a danger that we've all wrestled with as well, and that is recreating Western NGOs in other countries as a way of supporting civil society. And the recognition that civil society, it takes a lot of forms in a lot of different countries. It doesn't have to be, legally organized NGOs. And that's something that I think has been a challenge of how do you enable people to organize for change in a variety of models.
Thank you very much. I'm going to leave you with 3 thoughts just to wrap up our conversation because we have come to an end, I'm afraid. The first one is that peace does work, but we need to marshal the evidence, including harnessing data technology. Otherwise, I feel we will be stuck in the paradigm where peace is for NGOs and starting wars and ending conflict is for states. So we need to really work very hard on this particular aspect. Second, there is a need for multi-stakeholder frameworks, but they must be shared. Otherwise, we may unwittingly do harm. And therefore, and we also need to, as I think both of you did, to suspend certainties about certain assumptions that has been driving our work and question them. It's a healthy practice. The last point is basically to summarize a little bit of what we've been doing here at the International Peace Institute. While we do recognize that we need to focus on what drives conflict and address conflict and fragility, because it is the primary driver of instability. However, we are of the view, based on preliminary research, that if you only focus on what drives and sustains violence and not identify what still works, identify the resilient capacity that enables broken countries to continue more than just to survive, I am not sure we will lay the foundation for self-sustainable peace. And the fact that we are stuck with this dyad, with this bipolar relationship between conflict and peace, it excludes from our investigation peaceful countries. And what can we learn from peaceful countries? And I think the example of Senegal is telling in that sense, that if we really want to address the causes of violence, we need to learn what peaceful societies, despite internal contradiction and external pressure, remain stable. And it's these 2 elements that I think, with obviously the sustaining peace and the 2030 agenda being available as an overall arching framework. I thank you for coming despite all the adversity outside, and please join me in thanking our speakers by applauding them. Thank you.